I just wanted to take some time to talk to Once Forgiven, Now Free. I've been watching quite a few of his videos, and most of them I've just kind of shaken my head, but this time I actually wanted to sort of reach out and tap him on the shoulder a little bit. He posted a video criticizing DonExodus2 for his conversion to atheism, or not specifically criticizing it, but criticizing his statements about it. And I just found there were so many flaws, and such very interesting flaws, that I really thought I should make a video and have my say. One of the things I specifically wanted to bring up was the references to secular, non-Christian historians who believed in the divinity of Jesus. It didn't really strike a very logical chord to me. A historian doesn't tend to believe in the supernatural. So I looked into some of these people and was really quite surprised by what I found. The first one, Paula Fredrickson, that was mentioned, doesn't strike me as all that non-religious. She is a professor of religious studies, she has a theology degree, and she is currently, hang on, I had to write this down because it's long, the William Goodwin Aurelio Professor of the Appreciation of Scripture. That may be secular scripture, but I'm kind of dubious. I'm not saying she doesn't have credentials in her own field. She has degrees from places that I'm not cool enough to even look up on Google Maps. But really, she's not secular. She's not a non-Christian historian. She's obviously a Christian historian. That's okay, but don't call it what it's not. The other person is far more interesting, Gerd Ludemann. He actually is a non-Christian. Well, he wasn't. His studies were basically in the life and history of Jesus and in the early church, and his conclusions based on about 20 years of study in that field led him to completely abandon his faith and his belief in Jesus. He believes in Jesus as a historical figure still, but he wrote a 9-page letter to the Lutheran Church explaining why he could no longer be a part of their church. It's just bizarre and inexplicable to call him someone who supported the historical divinity of Jesus when he quite clearly didn't. He claimed that only about 5% of what was attributed to Jesus was actually done by Jesus, and I suspect that that 5% wasn't his resurrection. In fact, I have a quote from him here too, and I just wanted to read it because it seems to portray a quite different picture of the man. The insistence by Paul and early Christian faith generally on the fact, that's in quotes, of Jesus' resurrection by God must now be regarded as a falsification. Therefore, unless we totally redefine the word, people can no longer justify calling themselves Christian. That quote doesn't gel with anything that he said after he left the church, the Lutheran Church. He wrote a scathing book that included his abandonment of the church and called it The Great Deception, What Jesus Really Did. Again, he probably is a secular, non-Christian historian, but he also doesn't support the view you've purported at all. Moving on from there, you drew an analogy based on DonExodus2's comment that once you understand why you dismiss all other religions, you'll understand why I dismiss yours. The analogy that you made was that of a treehouse, and that one person says the treehouse was made by someone, and another person says the treehouse was made by someone else. And DonExodus2 claims that no one built the treehouse, it simply arrived there in a tornado or something. Obviously that's fatuous. Fatuous was what you were going for, and admirably succeeded in that, but that's not really what DonExodus was saying at all. You've presupposed a clearly constructed, clearly built item, and you've claimed that as what's in discussion, but in actual fact, the fact that it was something that had been built was what was up for discussion in any case. To make a better parallel, you could say that we're not arguing about a treehouse in the tree, but rather arguing about the tree. Let's say you say that your grandparents planted the tree, and I say that my grandparents planted the tree. DonExodus now comes in and suggests that in actual fact there is a grove of nearby trees, and probably a bird or some sort of animal picked up the seeds within fruit, and it was essentially planted by natural means. The idea isn't at all outlandish, and it's no more outlandish than the fact that your grandparents or my grandparents planted the tree. It's an entirely reasonable, verifiable, logical conclusion. Of course, as a probably more fair parallel, one of us could claim, or both of us could claim, that our grandparents were unicorns. Because then you've got the supernatural competing with the natural explanation. I don't really know that your analogy is a fair one, and in fact I would say it's not for those reasons. But another thing that I wanted to bring up is your explanation that you've given two equal weights to the two arguments, that, well, we don't know that it was this one or this one, and we argue about the character. But in fact, you're not arguing at all. You're claiming outright that your God is the one who made the ostensible treehouse, but you're not giving any credence to any other possible argument. The reason I say this is because when I say Zeus made the earth, or that Osiris made the earth, you're simply going to dismiss that outright. That's the point of what DonExodus2 said. And if you listen, he doesn't make an analogy. His analogy is not a bad one because it's not even an analogy. What it is a statement. In fact, it's a quotation. When you understand why you dismiss all other gods, you'll understand why I dismiss yours. It's actually a quite profound statement, because what it does is it allows someone to see the worldview of another person. In fact, it's an invitation to do exactly that. And I've seen quite a few of your videos, and you often make statements about worldview. Here you have an opportunity to actually look at someone else's worldview, and you've chosen instead to score snide points with bad analogies. If you have a look at that worldview, it's not a difficult thing to do. Simply take any of the thousands of gods that you don't believe in, and just answer the question, why don't you believe in that God? Take Osiris. Why do you not believe in Osiris? You don't have to, say, oh, well, it could be. Honestly, you don't believe in him. I don't believe in him. And the reason is quite simple. He's an irrelevant God, an old mystical concept from a time that is irrelevant to now. He's a superstition of a primitive people, simply conjured up to explain things that we now have better explanations for. You could say the same about Thor, you could say the same about Baal, you could say the same about any of a number of gods. The only difference is that we say the same of God. It's a strange thing that you can't actually see that. It's a strange thing that you've chosen to draw some sort of analogy from that, rather than simply looking at it as its most obvious and direct point. It is an important point, and if you understand why you dismiss all other gods, you could at least try then to understand why we dismiss yours. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but at least you'd understand why. There was a third point that I really needed to mention. Most of the rest of your video was just differences of worldview, differences of opinion, and to be honest, not really interesting enough to argue. But in terms of proof of God and in proof of God's healing, you showed a video of a man being healed and describing his healing, but please don't ever use the subjective personal experience of a man who just did a line of meth as proof of anything. Jeez. I mean, seriously, what were you thinking?